What's going on, everyone? So we had our first, I believe, 5K Star Wars Unlimited tournament on Sunday in Florida. It was over 140 players, I believe, 9 Swiss rounds, followed by a top 16. And there was a lot to watch. It was a long stream, basically all of yesterday. And I want to talk more generally about each of the matchups displayed here. I have the full top 16, their scoring, and which decks they are running and competing against. And I want to go through some of the matchups, some things you want to consider, and of course, just the overall meta breakdown, some cards that are really highlighted in each matchup. If you want to check out each of the individual deck lists, I'll leave a link to the event breakdown in the description down below. They have, I believe, all top 16 deck lists. I'm not sure. I couldn't find the analytics for the entire tournament, unfortunately, but as for the top 16, they have some like pretty bad images of some people submitting their decks, with a bunch of glare or on their like notepad or notes on their phone, etc., which is pretty funny. I do want to talk specifically about the winner of the whole tournament, the Vader blue list, as you can see in the middle there. Ended up taking down the tournament in convincing fashion. I want to talk a little bit more about Vader when we get to that point, because I do think Vader is starting to creep up in the meta and starting to become one of the more dominant performers as well. When I was watching Vader blue, it was really quite impressive. But we still have some of our regular contenders, which we'll talk about. If you want to pick up any of the cards here that I'm going to be going over or talking about or anything like that, I have a link to TCG Player in the description down below. It helps me out if you use that link, and it also helps out yourself. So use that link if you want to help me out. Thank you. But let's talk about the left side of the bracket here first, the top 16. So the top 16 are the two outer edges, and I'll move myself over on the other side when we talk about the right side of the bracket. But our first matchup here we're going to talk about is Sabine versus Han. Now, you'll notice I highlighted each of the leaders in whatever their secondary color was. So, for example, we have Sabine green versus Han red. In general, Sabine first here, we had 4 in the top 16. Most of them, 3 of the 4 decks, were running the Sabine green. And this is a very standard, most streamlined, I'd say, aggressive deck. It performed very well as it got 4 into the top 16, and also had 3 in the top 8, also 1 in the top 4. So Sabine overall, very well performer, and honestly took itself out, as you could see from the left side of the bracket. In this first matchup against Han was one of the more unique deck lists. It was Han red, as we normally see Han green running the more casino style, where you're trying to go to turn 4, action Han, and then deploy Han, attack with Han, and then get your Ewing reinforcements out on turn or round 4, which is really strong. This one was more of, okay, I'm going to leverage Han's action ability, just deploy threats, which was a lot different, and it just got absolutely run over by your streamlined aggro list. Things like Battlefield Marine, things like Sabine on 1, follow it up with Red 3's Wing Leaders, all of which are very difficult to deal with from Han, especially if you're able to deploy Sabine on turn 3, followed up with a Wing Leader. Suddenly you have a 4/7 Sabine, which is really nasty to deal with. It just got absolutely annihilated. Han was running the 30 HP base, but it did not help them take a match off of Sabine. All 3 of the Sabine green lists here were running ECL, and as we talk about the next matchup, the 2-1 Sabine Mirror, well, this one, it was pretty standard. For those of you that have been playing Star Wars Unlimited for a while and have been, attuned to the meta, this is kind of the quintessential meta deck that a lot of people consider Boba Green and Sabine Green. And when it went head to head, it was a 2-1 for one of the Sabine players, and they were all basically playing the same cards. It wasn't anything crazy. There wasn't anything like, we dropped in like a Mace Windu into here off of U-Wing Reinforce or something like that. There wasn't anything too crazy happening where one Sabine green list was trying to do something crazy. It was all very streamlined aggro lists, and it very much played out. So the people who have initiative are fortunately seated better, right? They perform better in the Swiss rounds, were able to take the play, and that does really matter in the mirror match, as Sabine herself really takes over in terms of actions, right? Because you use a lot of actions using your Sabine action. And so if you do have the initiative and you're on the play and you go something like Sabine Wren and they play a Battlefield Marine, if that was the opposite, like you were on the draw or you did not have initiative, you cannot attack into or you cannot defend against a Battlefield Marine as you play a Sabine on turn one. So you really, really need to make sure that your units match up well against theirs. If you play an A-Wing on turn one and they play an A-Wing on turn one, but you have initiative, guess what? You can just kill their A-Wing for free. And then the fact that they deal 1 damage to each base because they can, while not having initiative, doesn't matter for you because you care about that as well. So initiative really matters in this matchup, and it definitely did so in the ones that we saw. Leia versus Boba here was the next one, and Leia read the deck of my heart, the deck that I've played the most in person, and I've constantly tried to tee, and I just made a video about it yesterday. Absolutely got slapped around by Boba Green. This is not atypical. You really do see Boba Green take over in this matchup. I'll say, I think Sabine also has a hard time against Boba Green, and this is one of the reasons why Boba Green performs so well, generally speaking, is the fact that it does have decent matchups against the aggro lists. The fact that you're playing Leia but really does help out Boba Green as well, because they can oftentimes bounce, exhaust, or whatever it is, control the board with their tempo plays a lot better, and that means that your Leia action does absolutely nothing. And so we saw a lot of very, very dominant performances from Boba Green in the Leia matchup over the course of the last few months, but in this tournament as well. And of course, Leia has a really hard time dealing with a Steadfast Battalion ECL'd out on that turn 4. But Leia in particular was not running the Tarkin Town. They were running Castro City. So that is something to consider. I found Tarkin Town to be very important against Boba. Although that 5 HP is lost, it's still super, super important to have some additional interactive, action, and Tarkin Town really comes in handy there. Boba was running that ECL. Next up, we had a Vader Green versus Krennic Green. So Krennic Green is kind of the quintessential control list. We see this with Iden Green. We've seen it a lot. I think it's starting to shift towards more blue-red lists, but Krennic Green was our only traditional control deck, with the exception of one other one, as we'll talk about when we get to the right side of the bracket, that kind of got slapped around by Vader Green. I do think Vader Green has generally a good matchup, as the body having a 5/8 that, by the way, can just straight up one-shot a Krennic is very impactful. When you're dealing with control lists, Vader really is hard to deal with, unless you have something like Power of the Dark Side, you've already cleared their board, or like a Super Laser Blast. It's really, really difficult to deal with Vader. A lot of the other leaders aren't as nasty, and well entrenched comes into play extensively, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the right side of the bracket, as it's one of the key cards of the whole tournament, and arguably the most important card of the entire tournament, in my opinion. But just got slapped around by Vader Green. Also, this is the only Vader list of the top 16. We have a total of 3 Vader lists of the top 16 that was green, so pretty interesting there. On to the right side of the bracket, we start off with Boba Green versus Palp Blue. Now, I did mention this earlier, but Boba was responsible for 4 of the top 16, and all of them were Boba Green. All of them were pretty standard meta lists, as you would see with Boba Green. But this matchup against Palp Blue was actually pretty interesting. I got to see a lot of this Palp Blue in the Swiss rounds, as they were trying to follow it, as it's a little bit more exciting seeing Emperor Palpatine come out. I think one of the big things about Emperor Palpatine is a lot of people do not know how to play around Emperor Palpatine himself being deployed, as you need to have a damaged unit. And I've seen some people, I remember seeing one huge misplay from a player where they were beating down as an aggressive deck, and they ended up trying to trade or kill their opponent's Yularen, Colonel Yularen, to prevent them from healing. And because they did that, not only did they get less damage into the base, but they also had Emperor Palpatine just go ahead and steal their unit. So I've seen some plays like that. So Emperor Palpatine as a leader deploy is very powerful, and one of the reasons why people go ahead and play Palpatine in the first place, with the exception of Emperor Palpatine, being the leader. Generally speaking, I prefer Iden and the fact that they can come down sooner to stabilize the board. Because if you're at 8 resources, at that point, you're generally speaking able to stabilize with Super Laser Blast and your very large threats, as we saw with Vader. So Emperor Palpatine kind of just got, Boba greened out of the game, tempoed out. It was a 2-1, unlike, you know, some of the Krennic matchups and the Leia matchup. So it wasn't as stompy, but Boba Green did take it in the end. Next one was Boba Fett versus Luke Green. I will say, oh, I didn't mention, but this Emperor Palpatine was running a 30 HP base, no security complex. For the Luke matchup, this one was a pretty interesting one. I really, really like Luke. I think it's a really fun list. This one in particular was running Echo Base. It was not running ECL. All the Boba lists were running ECL. And seeing Luke without ECL felt a little bit weaker. I would have much preferred to have had ECL in a lot of these matchups, me personally, especially against the Vader matchup, where HP really didn't matter until they were just dead, right, in like 2 turns. It was pretty even, and we'll talk more about that later on, but ECL was something that I felt like they were missing. On the other hand, Luke Green really does perform well. There were a lot of games where they had Alliance Dispatcher turn 1, and it felt pretty brutal to see things like Kanan coming down on the following turn. So very, very powerful performance. And again, Boba Green, while it can be good against the shield tokens with things like Waylay and such, if you do get things down like Alliance Dispatcher, you can really start to outpace Boba, right? The entire idea about Boba is that you can play things and tempo out your opponent by playing multiple spells in a turn, by, you know, bouncing units, killing units, etc. But shield tokens prevent that, so then you're forced to bounce, and then they can just replay it, potentially even put shield tokens on it again, and that really hinders Boba's performance. So pretty nice thing from Luke here. And as you can see, we'll talk about the top 8 in a little bit, also performed well against the second Boba matchup that they had. Following that up, we have our first Vader Blue against Sabine Yellow. So this is a Sabine Yellow list, 30 HP base versus a Darth Vader list here. No security complex, also a Dagobah Swamp here as the secondary color. Vader Blue performed admirably well. This one in particular lost to Sabine. We'll talk about the other Vader Blue list that took down the whole tournament here. I very much like to see a more proactive control list, and that is what this Darth Vader list is. We're starting to see things like Iden Red come into play. I believe someone did a video on that. It's a very control heavy list. The thing about Iden Red here is that you don't have as powerful of an effect in the leader slot as you do with Vader. It's much more about, you know, trying to control the board and, you know, get a lot of value and just stay in the game by healing up. Vader, on the other hand, is just playing all removal and then leveraging the fact that you can just deploy Vader on an empty board, or, you know, oftentimes near empty, or like super laser blast and then deploy Vader and then just have Vader clean up anything that you need to. And I much prefer to see that. They did get 2-1 by Sabine, or 1-2 by Sabine Yellow, and this Sabine Yellow list was pretty interesting to see. I will note that this one we got to see on camera a lot from Frank Myers, who was piloting it. I do think there was a decent chunk of misplays with the Sabine Yellow list. It was very much the talk of the Twitch chat as we were watching the tournament, but there was a few things like Spec Force Soldier that was really critical. One of the big cards in the Vader Blue list here was Lieutenant Childson, and we'll talk more about that when we talk about Gee's list here that took down the whole tournament, because that Sentinel 5/5 coming down on round 3, you know, really hinders a lot of the Sabine game plan, as it comes down the same turn that Sabine gets deployed, so it can really prevent that big turn. So you really need to make sure you have certain things to be prepared for that. And unfortunately, I don't think the Sabine Yellow player matched up quite well against that Vader Blue list, as we see in the top 8, which we'll talk about more. The last matchup at the top 16 was the Vader Blue that took down the whole tournament versus Boba Green. And my goodness, this was not close at all. It was a 2-0, pretty convincing fashion. Once Vader gets out of the earlier turns, it can start doing double spells. One of the big key cards of this list, by the way, alongside your Lieutenant Childson, was Entrenched. Basically, every single game that we saw Vader against Boba on screen, we saw Entrenched being played on Boba, or Entrenched being played on Luke, or Entrenched being played on whatever it was that their leader was. You would see them play a removal spell like Takedown or Vanquish or whatever it was, and then just say pass. And then your opponents would be like, okay, I'll do this, and they'd say pass. I'll do this, pass. And then, despite them having 2 resources held up the entire time, the Vader Blue, your opponents would still deploy their leader straight into Entrenched. And Entrenched has no downside when you follow that up with something like Super Laser Blast and there's no units to attack. Okay, I think a lot of people were playing into Entrenched a crazy amount and just got absolutely destroyed by Entrenched coming out from Vader Blue. And the same thing applied against that Boba matchup, where you try to have that Boba turn where you bounce a unit, kill a unit, whatever it was, which is very rare, or just hit in for a lot of damage, and they couldn't because of Entrenched. It was really, really overperforming in this top 16 and then top 8 and then even the finals here. But let's talk about the top 8 here. First one up was the Sabine Mirror yet again, very similar to the one we talked about earlier. Same ECL, same 1-2 or 2-1 that we had. Again, this is a lot about initiative and well-placed wing leaders. Wing leader is a very, very key card in the matchup, as outsizing your opponent's units is really important. Another card that I saw was really, really nice was the ECL Zeb. I've seen a lot of people, running ECL Steadfast Battalion. And that's a little bit tricky because, you have to have Sabine deployed and it can have some swingy turns, right? But I've seen ECL Zeb where you ECL out a Zeb and boom, suddenly you kill 2 of their units and you keep your Zeb around. It can be a nightmare for your opponent to deal with. And that was a key card, especially in the Sabine Mirror. But again, very similar to this Sabine Mirror that we saw earlier. The next top 8 matchup was the Boba versus Vader Green. Boba Green ended up taking it down as they are a very similar style of deck, similar cards. We were running the ramp package. You're trying to get in to that higher costed units, or in Vader Boba Fett's case, trying to leverage the multiple spells that you can play in a turn. And that's one thing about Vader Green, is that you do rely on units. And because you're relying on units more so than the Vader Blue, Boba Fett is able to perform a lot better against it, right? You're able to use your action and use your leaders on attack trigger. When you don't have a lot of creatures or units to play, Boba gets a lot worse. And so I don't think Vader Green matched up nearly as well against Boba Green as something like Vader Blue. The left side of the bracket here, as we see, was a Boba Green versus the Luke Green matchup, and Luke Green took it down 2-0 against the Boba Green. Once again, we talked about this earlier, but in a well-placed Alliance Dispatcher into just leveraging the additional resources that you get every turn due to that, and then being able to outvalue your opponents, because Luke Green is the quintessential mid-range deck. Out of any of the decks here that we saw, Boba Green's your tempo, Sabine Green's your aggro, Vader Blue, Krennic Green, these are control lists. Luke Green is like the mid-range list. And it's just, if you get to that middle part of the game where you can deploy Luke and you're not under too much pressure, you just outvalue a Boba Fett, and that's exactly what happened. The last top 8 matchup that we saw was Sabine Yellow versus Vader Blue. This is one of the big matchups that a lot of people were focusing in on and starting to see the power of Vader Blue, as this is one that a lot of people were watching on camera. And my goodness, was this just an annihilation. I never really felt like Sabine Yellow was in a position to really win the game. And it really just was a dominant performance by Vader. Yes, there were some cases where Vader, was low on HP. That's certainly true. But I did always feel like Vader had the answer because they were running so many removal spells. And again, Entrenched was a key card in this matchup as well, alongside Vigilance. And this is one of those cards where we don't really see, command. We don't really see aggression all that frequently. Aggression is probably the least played. We do see Cunning pop up here and there, and Vigilance is basically played in every control list, or at least considered in the control lists. And against the aggro decks, against Sabine in particular, this is one of those cards that kills a unit and heals up the base to allow you to get to those really key turns. And when we saw Vigilance being played, it was an absolute nightmare for Sabine. And then we have the top 4, which was the Sabine Green versus Boba Green. This one's a really interesting one. As I mentioned earlier, against Leia Red, I do think the Boba Green decks are very well situated against the aggro decks. I do think Sabine has a bit of a better matchup against Boba Fett, depending on, of course, your sideboard. But you are able to get a little bit under your Boba Fett and actually get in a lot of, extra damage because of that action. But you also have the ECL from both sides, so that is able to kind of compete. Leia Red really doesn't have that ECL power. Despite all that, Boba still won 2-0. Very convincing, deploying things like, 3 resource boba, killing off your units, being able to tempo you out, and then just beat you down with your extra resources that you have every single turn, because Sabine's always playing units and Boba's always killing units and getting more resources. And so that's a really solid matchup for Boba Green. On the other side of the bracket, we had Luke Green versus Vader Blue. And out of any matchup in the entire top 16, I talked about Leia Red versus Boba Green and how that felt pretty bad. I talked about Sabine Green versus Han Red and how that felt pretty bad for Han Red. But this matchup in particular felt so one-sided, so ridiculously one-sided towards Vader Blue. One of the big problems with quintessential mid-range decks is that if you go a little bit bigger and you're able to control some of their mid-ranging threats, you just outvalue them, and that's exactly what Vader Blue did. There were many turns where, again, this is where Entrenched came into play. I think in both games, we saw Vanquish or Takedown come out, kill a unit. Vader was sitting at a nice 8 to 12 HP or damage on the base, so they still had 18 HP left. It wasn't really a huge threat. They were taking some damage. They would just pass. And then Luke would deploy, or the Luke player would deploy Luke straight into Entrenched, and then Vader would follow up with Super Laser Blast, and then deploy their Vader following that up. And it just felt so gross. Entrenched really sealed the deal, and every single time that it came down, it was disgustingly good. One of the other things that we did see from Vader Blue was Avenger coming out to finish off the game. And once Avenger came down, it felt like Luke could not play the game, and it was just an instant GG. It was really gross from Vader Blue. Very impressive stuff. One of the things I didn't mention earlier about the Vader Blue is one of the key cards in the sideboard was also Devotion, and I saw this come out against some of the more aggro decks. It is a crazy card, guys. Do not underestimate Devotion in playing it again on Inferno 4 and just healing to every single turn and chipping in for some damage. It can be really oppressive. But this Luke Green versus Vader Blue, if you played the starter decks, you would feel the same way, because I always felt Vader was just absolutely dominant over Luke, but this also felt the same exact way. It was pretty nasty. On to our finals matchup, and well, this is where I want to kind of dive into the more specific list of Vader Blue. As you can see, it did win 2-0 against Boba Green, and this was the entire deck list that we got to see from the Vader Blue player, and this is what they are running throughout the entire tournament. A couple of key cards here that I did talk about a little bit. Entrenched, we had 3 copies of it in the main deck, 3 copies of Lieutenant Childson, and one of the big things that you'll note is that there's very few red cards or non-blue cards. In total, there's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 cards that are not blue. That's really key, because we saw Lieutenant Childson for 5 or 6 or at least revealing 3 or 4 blue cards every single time it came down, and that is really disgusting. There's another couple of Viper Pro droids that are adding in there, so a couple of hits that don't work as well. Entrenched, Lieutenant Childson, Vigilance, and Super Laser Blasts. Those are the cards that really felt devastating in every single matchup, and they're playing a lot of removal spells, right? They have 1 copy of Force Lightning, that's kind of to combo with Darth Vader. They have the 3 copies of Entrenched. They have 3 copies of Force Choke, 3 copies of Power of the Dark Side, 3 copies of Make an Opening, 3 copies of Open Fire, 3 copies of Vigilance, 3 copies of Takedown, 2 copies of Vanquish, and 3 copies of Super Laser Blast. If you look at the list, we have 6, 9, 12, 15, 17, 20, 23, 26 different removal spells. If you count Emperor Palpatine and Avenger, that goes up to 31. And this is absolutely absurd. We also have a small synergy with the Vader action in Death Star Stormtrooper, but you'll notice that the Vader action wasn't particularly relevant. Honestly, it was really just for the backside, and I think that's really important, as that backside leader gives you enough power and enough control to really just play Vader Blue and perform a lot better. This list was extremely impressive, and Avenger just kind of sealed the deal in a lot of different games. As soon as Avenger came down after Super Laser Blast, the game just was over. It wasn't even particularly close. Lieutenant Childson and System Patrol Craft were really important sentinels for the deck, as I mentioned. Lieutenant Childson was an absolute brick wall. When this comes down on round 3 as a 6/6 sentinel, you are just game over. You go turn 1, Sabine. Turn 2, maybe they kill your Sabine with Power of the Dark Side. You play like an Echo-based defender. Turn 3, they get to play Lieutenant Childson as a 6/6, and you have an Echo-based defender and a Sabine Ren leader. Both of those units die in training with Lieutenant Childson. It is a nightmare. It's really, really important to see. As for the sideboard, as I mentioned, a few key cards that are kind of, a little bit more rare. Devotion was a really, really sick one to see. We had 2 copies of Devotion. I saw this being played on Inferno 4 most frequently, as it made it a 3/4, which allowed it to trade into some of the space units and still live. But the fact that it had Restore 2 against the aggro decks, this is a really, really big nightmare card. There's also 3 copies of Repair in the sideboard. Once again, because we have Vader as our leader in this deck, you really don't need a whole lot else. It is really, really disgusting to see Repair being used and just leveraging the fact that you have such a powerful late game. 2 copies of Vader's Lightsaber. I didn't really see this being super relevant, but it is a nice little additional removal spell after Vader comes down. 1 Search Your Feelings is an additional copy of any of these cards. I didn't see this card being used at all in the top 16. 1 copy of Bombing Run and Forced Surrender. Again, didn't see any of these cards being played in the top 16 as far as I remember, but both Bombing Run and Forced Surrender can be pretty interesting if you are able to put it in the right situation, especially against, them dominating a space arena or ground arena and then Bombing Run to finish off the deal. That was the entire top 16 and the finals matchup here. Vader Blue, guys. Entrenched. Do not underestimate Entrenched. I want to do another video on like some cards that I think people are super underrating. And I think that they're going to rise in value as we still have a few months left with this single set. And I think Entrenched is one of those cards where a lot of people are sleeping on. I've talked a little bit about it. I put a few in I put it always basically in the controlling sideboard. Because I found it to be very good, but this one just played it straight up main deck, and I completely agree with the situation. Entrenched on a leader, it's one of the few ways you can just cleanly deal with a leader, even in the later sort of stages of the game, right? It's very hard to deal with a Boba Fett on turn 4 without playing something like Entrenched, right? Vanquish doesn't kill it, Takedown doesn't kill it. The only thing that kills is like Power to the Dark Side, but that requires you to have a clean board. Super Laser Blast is a lot later, but Entrenched, my goodness, allows you to double spell, and it just completely ruins the game for your opponent. So pretty key card, pretty sweet top 16. I want to do a full meta report if I can, but this video is already long enough talking about each of the matchups, not even going in depth into each of the deck lists. So that's pretty crazy. Hopefully you all enjoyed. And if you wanted to check out any of the deck lists, again, it's going to be in the description down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all for the next one.